In this lecture video, I'm going to go over the cavities of the body and also the membranes that make up the body. So in the last lecture video, I talked about the fact that you can really divide our skeleton into two components. We have the axial skeleton, which is essentially our trunk. It's made up of our abdomen, our thorax, and our cranium, our head, and that's our trunk. And then we have our appendicular skeleton, which is made up of our arms and our legs. We have no cavities in our appendicular skeleton. Our arms and legs are composed of bone, tissue, muscle, blood vessels, nerves, but there's no organs in there. We don't have any, they're strictly there for movement. All of our organs exist in our axial skeleton. And that's where we have our cavities, because obviously if you have an organ, you need somewhere to put it. So let's go through that now. So first of all, as I just said, the major body cavities, the axial portion of the body, has two main cavities. We have the dorsal cavity, which I'm going to go over first, and then we have the ventral cavity. So if you've ever heard of a dorsal fin before, dorsal means back. So the dorsal cavity is really the cavities of the back of the body. And it has broken down to two smaller cavities called the cranial and the vertebral cavities. So let's start with the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity is really made up of your head, and that has a couple different areas. First of all, the cranial cavity is where our brain is held. But also we have a couple other cavities in there that are going to be what composed of the face. We have the nasal cavity, which is the opening area where your nose is, and that's where air comes in. We have the orbital cavities, which are going to be where your eyes sit. We have the oral cavity, which is your mouth. The middle ear cavity is deep within your ear. There's actually an opening. That is where you have, your eardrum, you have the hammer, and you have the bones that are used for hearing, those inner ear bones, that actually connects through a eustachian tube to the back of your throat. So if you've ever cleared your throat before, you hear it in your ears, that's because those are actually connected to each other. And then finally, we have something called our sinuses. And you don't need to know the specific names of the sinuses, but we have several sinuses. For example, we have our frontal sinuses, we have our sphenoid sinuses on the side, and then the main ones we feel are right in here. And if you've ever had buildup pressure, like if you deal with allergies, basically what the sinuses are, they are a space where they think it's to decrease the weight of your skull, to make your head a little lighter, because you got to carry it around on your shoulders all day. But also it's for pressure release, for a buildup of mucus, right? So mucus is what we use to fight off infection, and we'll talk more about that in the next unit. But these areas, these sinuses think of them as open rooms for overflow. And if you've ever had sinus pressure before, it's because you have a buildup of mucus from an allergic reaction. And then the vertebral cavity is really just what includes the spinal cord. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, wait a second, Mr. Adolph, how could the face be dorsal? Because, the dorsal is on the front of the dorsal is the back and your face is on the front. And that's a great question. So let me just draw a quick picture to show you what I mean. Okay, so bear with me as I try to navigate this. Okay, so if this is a person, right, you got your face here. The cranial, well, it's a big head there. The cranial cavity is considered part of the dorsal because it's attached to the spinal cavity or the vertebral cavity. So even though the face is here, and that is the ventral surface, the front of the body, because the head and the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity are connected to each other, they are both considered the back of the body. So I just wanted to make sure you understood why the facial area would still be considered dorsal, even though dorsal means back and it's on the front. Okay, let's talk about the next set of cavities. Now we're going to talk about our ventral cavities, and these are on the front of the body. And there's actually it's broken into two smaller cavities. So I'm going to run through these now. Your head's going to be spinning at the end, but I think we'll be okay. All right, so let's go through it. So the ventral cavity is really broken into two smaller cavities. The first one is called the thoracic cavity. The thorax is going to be your chest. So the thoracic cavity is this right up here. So let me get my pointer going. So this would be the thoracic cavity frontal view, and this will be a thoracic cavity on the side view, that blue area. And what the thoracic cavity includes is it includes a couple different components. The first one is called the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity, we actually have two of them, one on the left over here and one on the right over there. And the pleural cavity is where your lungs live. Now here's the nice thing about the pleural cavity. Pleural in this term doesn't actually mean the word plural, like plural means more than one, right? If I say what's the plural of car, you would say cars. Well, luckily, plural in this case, even though it doesn't mean more than one, we have more than one lung. So the way you can remember that is the pleural cavity, there's two of them, and that is going to be this green section here, which is where the lungs are contained. The middle of the here is called the mediastinum, and that is kind of a mouthful to say, but in between the two lungs we have another space called the mediastinum. So really it refers to this small yellow area up here. Even though the heart is also technically in the mediastinum, it has its own name. That cavity has its own name. So the mediastinum is going to have like your esophagus and your trachea right there. That's also going to be where your thyroid gland is. So we have our lungs are plural, and then the mediastinum is between them. And then finally, in the thoracic cavity, we have the pericardial cavity, which is where your heart lives. So it's this space right here where the heart is. So just a quick review, we have the thoracic cavity, which is all of this, and then that gets broken down into the pleural cavity where the lungs are, the mediastinum, which is this top portion here in the middle, and then the pericardial, which is where the heart lives. Now, we also have a very important muscle that sits just below or just superficial to the lungs called the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm, as you know, is important for breathing, but it has another very important job. It acts as the floor of the thoracic cavity. If we didn't have a diaphragm, your lungs and heart would just fall into your stomach. That would be a problem. So you have this flat sheet-like muscle that extends for the entirety of that area of your body. It's a large flat muscle, and it allows for breathing, but it also is the dividing line between the thoracic cavity and the lower cavity, which I'm about to talk about now. So it goes pleural, mediastinum, and pericardial in the thoracic. Then we have our diaphragm, which is the dividing line. It separates the two cavities, and it also prevents the lungs and heart from falling into your stomach. And then the lower cavity has a name as well. It's called the abdominopelvic cavity. So this large cavity here is called the abdominopelvic cavity. That is broken down into two smaller cavities as well. The top part is called the abdominal cavity. That is where all of your digestive organs are. Your stomach, your spleen, your kidneys, that's urinary, not digestive. But any of the organs in this large cavity here, that is going to be called your abdominal cavity. And then finally, this little bottom cavity right here is called the pelvic cavity. And that is where we have our reproductive organs. And also that is where we have the end of your digestive and urinary system. So quick overview. Let's just run through them real quick. And you are going to be expected to know these different cavities. So on the posterior or dorsal cavities, we have our cranial and our vertebral right here. So it's just those two. This diagram doesn't have the facial, but those are also included. We have our orbital, our nasal, our oral, our middle ear, and then our sinuses. And then we have our ventral cavities, which is going to be our thoracic and our abdominopelvic. And then the thoracic gets broken down into our pleural, which is where the lungs live, our mediastinum, which is in the middle, and our pericardial, which is where the heart lives. We have our diaphragm, which separates the two cavities, and then we have our inferior cavity, which is made up of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, which is called the abdominopelvic. And the abdominal cavity has the digestive organs, and then also the urinary and a lot of endocrine. And then the pelvic cavity has the reproductive organs. I'm going to do the membranes in a separate lecture because I think that's a lot for one lecture. Thank you.